Are you ready?
Okay, it is 7 o'clock. We will start this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. First item of business is citizen comments. I see no citizens in the audience, so we will move on to the next item, which is the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, draft summary of demand and need analysis and key findings. So I'll turn it over to our city staff.
Okay, thanks, Commissioners. This is Maureen Kalaisi. She's managing this project as it moves forward. And if you remember last week, we talked about the goals, objectives, and policies. And I know you're all eager to get into the need and demand analysis, and a lot of your questions focused on that. So that's what we're here to talk to you about tonight. In your packet, there was a draft demand and need analysis report. And I would say that this is a draft, and it will be refined. So what we want to kind of focus on today is sort of more of a high level and focusing on the findings and how they inform the pros plan. So you will be seeing this document again. It's not in its final format, but if you had any specific comments, particularly in terms of the actual framework rather than at an editing level. So try and stay above the editing level at this point, but any sort of comments you have on that report, please let us know. But if you don't have any burning questions at this minute, I will turn it over to Maureen. It's the only item on the agenda this evening, so if we're efficient, we might be able to get through this before 9 o'clock. I think, the presentation will probably be about 20 minutes, and so we'll have time for questions, so we might be able to get out of here early tonight. So on that, I will turn it over to you might want to raise your screen so you can kind of follow along. And then
Just getting it ready.
Okay.
Well, good evening.
Yes, sorry, Maureen,
yeah,
before you were to
sure.
begin, would it be possible for someone to email me a copy of the presentation so I can follow along remotely?
Can she do that? Let's go to her desk.
we can work on that. Where's it saved? I'll go do that. Mike, I'm gonna go back to my desk and do that right now, so you might miss sort of one slide, but I'll be as quick as I can, okay?
Thank you.
Actually, I can do a short introduction so that it gives us a little more time. And I have to apologize, I have a little bit of a hoarse throat for some reason, so please bear with me. And I apologize for missing the last meeting, but you had some really great conversation and a lot of questions, so I'm hoping that you're excited about what you read, and maybe it leads to more questions, but hopefully it provides you some context for where you were last week and kind of where we're sort of headed with the analysis. This is a piece of the PROS plan that we did hire consultant services for. HBB Landscape Architects has been hired to assist us with developing this analysis. So it's in draft form, and it's what I would call a collaborative working document between staff and our consultant, but the primary document was pulled together by them, and then obviously we look at it and finesse it and have, kind of look at it through the city's lenses as well. But there could be things that we didn't see or that seem, that needs more clarification. So let me know if that's the case in any area, because we're still working on it. And in fact, I have seen kind of an updated version of it that ties some of the comments that we had earlier for them into place. So you're gonna, and probably a month from now, you'll get more detailed information coming to you. I think this, again, in this slide that I'm going to be going to is a one that we looked at in April when we did an introduction about the PROS plan and you did discuss with Debbie last week. So again, it's a repetitive slide, but it's very important. We're talking about the context for the plan and geography and not the natural environment does play a huge role in our park system here in Kenmore. It is fabulous because we have such a unique park system in the sense that it's not just a flat piece of land with grass. It's actually very, environmentally critically sensitive. With, I think I gave you some stats when we first met that 80% of the park system is in a critical area or urban forest. So that's a pretty high percentage of our park system that is encumbered basically by, environmental sensitive areas. Steep slopes are also something that we deal with, so that limits us for putting in open field areas for athletics and so forth. And we talked a lot about the shoreline and the inability people have experienced here in Kenmore of accessing public open space along the waterfront. And also connectivity between the neighborhood, downtown, and our park system. We have a really walkable city, but our connections are probably lacking in safe connections. So that's another theme we have talked about throughout this process, and you'll continue to see in this analysis document. Demographics play a huge role in this. What is our current population? What are we expecting in the future? With, like, the statistics are about 24 to 25% increase in population in 2035. We are primarily middle-aged in our population, and although the majority of people are white, we are seeing an increase in our demographics in terms of diversity, and very anxious for the 2020 census, but we don't have that yet, so we have to live with the statistics we have at the moment. But again, the trend across the region is that diversity is increasing, and we should see that here in Kenmore as well. Again, this is a review slide from April, and with an updated map, but basically the same concept here. In our park system, we have about 146 and 47 acres, which, like I mentioned, 80% of that is encumbered. A total of 475 acres if you include the state park, the boat launch, our Burke-Gilman Regional Trail, Bastyr Fields, and the fishing dock at the Harbor Marina. Schoolyards are also not included in this acreage, and that's due in part that they're not fully available to the public, but they still provide a lot of recreation value. Okay, so I'm trying to see if we can wait. And Commissioner, over the phone, if you do receive the document from Debbie, just let me know.
I have it now, thank you.
Okay, so we would be on about slide 3, possibly. Slide 4. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about one of the earlier slides about the population growth. I think it was, I believe it was 4 to 5,000 additional residents. Was that the number?
It's about, and the correct number I think is
5.5, excuse me.
Yeah.
Are most of those expected to be in the sort of central downtown area, or are more distributed around our single-family neighborhoods, or do you have any
We do have
projections of breakdowns about how that might, I know it's an estimate, but how that might play out?
We have some of that analysis in the presentation, and we can talk a little bit to that. But in general, downtown is where the density is increasing, but along the outskirts of the city is also where we're going to see population increases, as kind of the border between Snohomish County and the city is the other area we're seeing density. Does that sound about right, Debbie?
Yeah, so we can't know exactly where we think growth will go, but where we have more capacity for growth is in the downtown areas, in the multifamily zoned areas.
Okay, so one of the things I also talked about in April is the park classifications and why we do this. It plays a lot in the need analysis and in terms of geography, like where are our parks and open spaces and how well are they distributed through the city. And their geographic service areas play into that discussion, and that's what we're kind of going to be reviewing today. And there's about 4 types of parks that we're proposing for this PROS plan. It's a little different from the past PROS plan. These did exist in the PROS plan, but there were, I think, 2 additional categories, but they were duplicative. So we want to try to simplify the categories and keep them very clean instead of having this like, well, we have a waterfront park, but it's also a regional park. And so what does that mean? So in terms of analysis, it really makes a difference for us to keep the categories, all parks within one category versus multiple categories. So, you know, regional facilities are generally ones that have unique features or amenities that serve beyond our city limits. You know, Log Boom Park is an example of that. The Burt Gilman Trail is an example of that. The community level parks are smaller usually than regional parks, but not necessarily. And they serve a broad range of community needs within the city to meet potentially both active recreation uses and passive. Neighborhood parks are what we would like to see more frequently in a city, because it's really trying to serve you at the closest point of your house. Where can you walk and receive park and open space services directly? And the neighborhood park with a radius of about 10 minutes, which is equivalent to about a half a mile, is where you would find, you know, facilities in your neighborhood. And these are essential neighborhood park amenities such as open space, pathways, and playgrounds. And then linear parks, and they can take on the form of, you know, active recreation linear, or in terms of open space linear. Their intention is really to, as connectors, connecting both pedestrian and bicycle users and also wildlife habitat. So these are maps that you haven't seen yet. They weren't in your packet. But what you're seeing here is how each one of these relates in terms of its service areas in the city. Neighborhood parks, which has a smallest radius of about a 10-minute walk, and which parks are considered neighborhood parks in their distribution. As you can see, we've got pretty good coverage in the north part of the city, but very little coverage in the south part of the city in terms of neighborhood category parks. If you look at community parks, and again, this isn't just to give you an example of how it serves the community. It's a larger radius. It's about 3/4 mile, and which is about 2 to 3 minute drive. And these community level parks are, like, again, serving a larger need for the community. And we have pretty good distribution, but again, more highly concentrated around the waterfront, and then obviously in the north end of the city. And then you have regional parks, which the yellow represents that it's a citywide radius, which means that, you know, it's available to all city residents and then also regional residents as well. And so if you were to kind of put all of these maps together, you would see that essentially we're meeting the community's needs, but through a variety of different park classifications. So that's some of the, I guess, basis for the analysis. There's a lot more that went into this, and I will go through what we use to help analyze demand and need. But essentially, those are background information that was very much what you need to have the foundation for to start the process of analyzing. And why do we do this? We provide this data. The data provides supporting information for us to help identify what park and recreation programs and facilities are important and should be made. And then also it aids us in prioritizing programming and capital improvements. And in this particular analysis, what we used for that analysis is community interest and opinion. That's our surveys, our community outreach. And if you had read through that section, there were about 4 or 5 different types of community outreach that we used in this analysis. Most of the statistics quoted were from the 2019 survey, but a lot of that background documentation went into the key findings, which was from the Imagine Kenmore process. City's geography, and I mentioned this before, built and natural environment conditions play a large role in what kind of services we can provide. The community's demographics, as I mentioned before, existing facilities and their current use and condition. So that relates to infrastructure needs. I mean, we hear from the community what they desire and love to see in their park system in terms of programs and facilities, but you also have to look at our assets and look at what their condition is and whether there's a need for improving the condition over time. Existing programs, program offerings and participation. Again, the demand for services. And service comparisons. How do we stack up against other communities locally and through the United States? And how does our park system compare? And then trends. What are the trends or the most recent trends in recreation facilities and park use and stewardship? So I'm going to be taking a quick summary overview of what each of those things, a lot of writing went into them, a lot of statistics. So I'm really not going to get into the details of that, but simply at a very high level talk about what did we analyze and what were the key findings from that analysis. So I'm going to start off with trends because when we looked at how to put all of this together in a document, sometimes trends are very helpful because they're usually national and they kind of go all the way down to the local level. So it gives you a really good place to start from to look at your own park system is looking at trends. Let me get my notes. Sorry about that. So I'm not going to read through all of that on the slide, but this is a summary of the information that was gathered around national, state, and local trends. But in terms of key findings, what we discovered was that parks need to be accessible, safe, and welcoming, and to be flexible to serve the widest audience and broad communities' needs. Parks are becoming a key strategy in climate resilience and environmental sustainability through design and stewardship. Parks are a catalyst for future stewards of our community, offering a safe place to explore, discover, and understand the balance of our ecology, especially within the urban fabric of our community. Recreation facilities and program needs need to support active lifestyles for all ages and abilities. And then lastly, parks can improve civic pride and create a sense of place by providing art, outdoor gathering places, such as public fountains like we have at the hangar, interpretation of our local history and natural environment, and obviously protecting important views and view corridors, which I think has been a theme that has carried through from the previous plan as well. So community interest. Again, we had about 6 pieces of data sets that we pulled from. So if you didn't see the exact information and how the key findings came about is because it's from a really large pool of information. We do have more outreach to conduct. We have a public open house planned in the future. We want to get out to some summer events. And I understand from the conversations last week that there's an interest for us to reach out to the schools. So we might try to do that this fall and see how we can make more contact with the schools and ask more youth what they think. But in general, what we heard from all of the analysis that we did was there were some major themes. Access to the water, waterfront access and activities to really take advantage of that natural resource that we have running through the city between Swamp Creek, the Sammamish River, and Lake Washington. Assuring opportunities exist, improving and acquiring new facilities. So not only do we have parks, but what is the quality of what's in them? Are there good recreation opportunities to engage in? Preserving, protecting the experience, and experiencing the natural resources through acquiring, stewarding, and education, and about recreating and about recreating within. Improving connectivity to, between, and within parks, and the need for local recreation. So we are a small city. We can't provide everything that maybe the community has an interest in, but there was definitely a lot of conversation around trying to see if we can recreate here at home. Out of the latest community survey, there are some top facility and recreation program needs that rose to the top. And that's what is shown here. Again, these themes seem to have rolled through from 2013 all the way through 2019 and all during the Imagine Kenmore process. Nature trails high on the list. Still have an interest for indoor facilities and potentially aquatics. Again, walking trails, bike paths, off-leash areas, and then in terms of programming, how can we stay healthy and active in our older years, and providing, I guess, more art programming and cultural events. And environmental education is also something that has risen to the top. This is looking at national targets and benchmarks. The National Park and Recreation Association has a document, and in fact, they have a survey that they ask park and recreation organizations to fill out, which gives them data with regards to your operations, your programs, and your facilities. And that document really then becomes something that they share with their users. It's available on their website, and it basically tells you what are the trends across the whole United States in terms of providing recreation. So what are some of the key findings that we learned by looking at the NRPA's benchmarking is that in terms of Kenmore, with all of the public recreation facilities in the city, including the city's own, that's the 475 acres that was calculated for parks and open space in the city. Kenmore exceeds the national and regional average. And again, according to NRPA National Park and Recreation findings, Kenmore is below average for dog parks, spray parks, community gardens, multi-purpose courts, indoor recreation, and aquatic facilities.
What is a spray park? I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Splash pad. It's like an outdoor facility that water sprays down, and then it is then goes into the system. It's sort of similar to an outdoor fountain, but it's intended for more recreation use.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't get out often, I guess, but.
Super popular in the southern states, like
Okay.
Nevada, California, where they have nice weather.
Yes.
Okay.
And
There's also one here in Seattle.
oh, there's several in Seattle, and
There's a great one up in Southern Michigan.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
We have renovation by the way.
Yeah. The trend locally with regards to splash pads or spray parks is that wading pools were very popular a while back, but they require a higher level of aquatic support, meaning they need to be manned by lifeguards. And so in Seattle, there's still a few still remaining out there, but there are probably 10 in the system. And as they've come to the end of their life cycle, they've basically been converting those to spray parks, which allow for water play without the need of having to have a staff person there. But water quality is still tested on those, and it still kind of has operational needs, but it's not as significant as doing a wading pool. Kenmore could also, based on what we just learned, is that we're a little below average on providing some what I would call special needs facilities. Some of the what I would say is what's trending in recreation, outdoor parks and recreation, that we could really do a better job of providing a variety of recreational facilities, and to try to move ourselves closer to the regional and local target. Okay, so this slide is pretty busy, so I don't want you to have to be sitting there trying to read all of this, but basically in terms of population growth, I wanted to show you that we did some work as part of the Park Impact Fee Rate Study that related to developing an investment needed for growth. And then when you look on the chart over on your right, the bottom line is what you're trying to look at, in that our current park system is about 75, sorry, I'm phasing out here, $1 million. So essentially what we did here was we inventoried all of the park assets, and then we took and we evaluated what the cost was for those assets in 2019 dollars. And then you add them up, and that's what you get as your value for your park system. And then how you project that in terms of investment for growth was that you look at your population growth in 2035, and what your value is per capita. That's what relates to your $75 million. And that's where you get the investment needed for growth, which is an additional $18 million. And that's when in your report you saw these bubbles with these little call-outs, and I just wanted to show you that there is real work that went in to figuring out what those numbers are and where that basis of information came from. In terms of demographics, again, we've talked about this already, and I know at the last meeting you had a request to provide you information on the statistics between our community survey respondents and our census, and this is the chart right here that we'll be putting into the plan and the need analysis assessment. And on the left is basically some demographic information about ethnicity and languages. And in terms of key findings, what we have discovered is that recreation facilities that support alternative transportation are desirable because we have a large population that commutes, and it would be great to be able to provide facilities that provide alternative methods of transportation so that we don't have to be in our cars all the time. And also activities that support an active lifestyle for aging adults because of our aged population. We are going to see that trend continue where our population will continue to get older, and providing active alternatives for our community to recreate. And then again, providing a greater variety of recreation facilities. And again, you can start to see there's some themes that run through each level of analysis. There are also some things that may seem like they conflict, like I mentioned in the staff report. But essentially, this is the things that we're noticing as we can go through each section. So geographic context, this is kind of talking about the classifications in service in terms of, are we meeting the need of our residents in terms of distribution of park facilities. So the TPL, which is the, sorry, I'm having the Trust for Public Lands, has a website that they created called ParkServe. And it actually is a mesh of all throughout the United States. Their goal was to try to see if we could get the United States to be within a 10-minute walk of a park. And so they had GIS professionals doing analysis on walkability of every community throughout the United States. And believe it or not, Kenmore is in that. And so the map that you see on your right is a product of the Trust for Public Lands work that we are allowed to now use to help us in understanding whether our community is walkable. And the statistics show that 73% of our residents are within a 10-minute walk of a park or open space, which is really good. Not every community can say that. And so why you don't see perfect circles here, that's another thing I wanted to kind of talk to you about, is that walk sheds are developed around walkability. They don't necessarily line up to be perfect circles. They have the capacity to do a more complex analysis than we can. And so that's why ours look like circles and theirs looks like a little bit different than that. So there are some gaps. As you saw on the map, there were some white spots that weren't yellow. And what this diagram here is showing you is that the ideal would be to be able to fill those gaps. You know, we show a gap of potentially 6 areas, but we know that that's probably not realistic and to be able to meet the gap entirely. And so the darker circles are thoughts on whether we could try to meet at least where we think the majority of the gap is, or the largest part of the gap in the northeast section of the city and in the south central section of the city near Moorlands. But we need to do a little more work. I mean, this is mapping at a very high level, and the idea here is that you would be looking at what the geography looks like. Is it steep slopes? Is it feasible to provide those, fill those gaps? And that'll go into more of our analysis and our, recommendations moving forward when we look at how would we fill gaps by acquiring land. Creating safe routes is also important, and that's something that we are working on here at the city with the walkways and waterways effort. With both 68th and Juanita Drive going to be receiving some improvements along the bridge area. So we've got a nice vein between that and the Burt Gilman Trail that I think is really great, and now it's kind of trying to look at the network of streets and see how we can provide, better access throughout the whole system. In terms of geographic context, our key findings, it's more than just what I showed you in terms of the maps. It's looking at a lot of information around our parks and how they're distributed, the inventory, the asset condition assessment. So when you look at the list of things that we're considering for key findings, it's not just about the little pieces that I showed you. There's a lot more analysis that went into this. But again, making routes safer for walking, acquiring new land in areas where residential development is expected to occur, acquiring parkland along the waterfront, and then connecting these public open spaces. Assessing the feasibility of acquiring and developing 2 new parks in those areas where we saw the largest gaps. Developing a master plan and implementing renovations at Linwood Park. It is one of the only parks in our system that hasn't received any recent renovations since incorporation, outside of Squires Landing, but it's identified for improvements here in the next 6 years. Our new park, Twin Springs Park, we'd like to be able to prepare that for opening to the community as a neighborhood park level use. Implementing any existing master plans for other parks and trails as opportunity and funding is available. And then providing access to the natural resources. And this is kind of what Walkways and Waterways is doing in terms of the waterways projects, is really trying to get people to that resource, our water. So that's an example of that. So now we're going to dive into recreation programming and recreation participation. So some of the key findings that we have learned on programming is that really we need to partner with other organizations and agencies, because we are not necessarily, as a small city, set up to do recreation programming from within. So it's really going to take us reaching out to other outside organizations to help make programming happen in Kenmore. Trying to expand offerings. Right now we have a pretty limited offering of recreation programming, and how can we expand that? Developing a method for tracking participation, and again, taking an active role in advertising programs that are available, not just ones that we sponsor, but that other organizations are out there doing. And making it available in ways in which people with diverse backgrounds can access the information. Considering offerings and considering doing scholarships, which is something the city hasn't done yet, but some organizations we work with do. So whether that is something that would increase participation for those who don't have the means. And ensuring program venues are accessible and that they have the appropriate support for providing programming within our facilities.
I have a question about that. So throughout the document, it talks about partnering with other organizations, or for an aquatic center, for instance, maybe a regional one. Is there a number of miles that a person would travel for that, a limited number that kind of fits into the whole plan?
I definitely don't have an answer for that, but there was a feasibility study done on the aquatics that took into consideration more of a regional draw, and Debbie could probably talk to that more.
I don't know if there is a standard. We can look into that. But the service area of the North Shore School District looked at several years ago the feasibility of an aquatic centre, and they looked at where to place one which would be sort of central to that service area. I guess so. My assumption would be on that people within at least the boundaries of the school district would be willing to travel somewhere within the school district to reach it. So that's, you know, as far away as Woodinville on the north end. And obviously for the aquatic centre, I remember they studied different locations in different communities, kind of recognizing that not every community could have one. But you can imagine that there was sort of, well, you know, everybody wanted it in their community, but nobody wanted to pay for it in their community. So I think that's the challenge, and that's probably the reason why that study has not really gone any further, because although there is a desire to do one, you know, the rubber hits the road, and are you willing to pay for it? And there's sort of a lot of silence around that. Answer that second question, but we can certainly look and see if there is a standard for travel.
Right, and so it's kind of the same question for ball fields, because in the document, it mentioned that the need for additional, that we're not satisfied with what we have now, and we're going to need more. So how far people are willing to drive for those, I'd also be interested in that.
Oh, great, thanks. One more?
Yeah, I had I don't know if a question or comment, but speaking about aquatic facilities and mentioning scholarships here, and maybe this is just not knowable, but is the limitation for people to go to pools outside of Kenmore, is it the travel time, or is it the financial resources to pay for that? I mean, are scholarships even something that would be considered for getting more Kenmore people to go to the Y in Bothell or Mount Lake Terrace pool or whatever I'm sure there's pools in Kirkland as well, but I'm just kind of curious if you have any sense about what would help Kenmore residents access the aquatic facilities that they clearly want.
That's a great idea, actually. So, but yeah, right now we don't necessarily have any knowledge about whether people have any limitations for what they're receiving outside of the city. I know there was a question that came in about the community survey and whether we polled people about what facilities they use outside of the city. It was mostly specific to their needs within the city. So we didn't really ask people, but we did have a list of, other providers, but they were providers in Kenmore, not outside of Kenmore.
Right.
I think the only other one that was in Bothell was the North Shore Senior Center that was identified, but everything else I think was mostly in Kenmore.
So maybe part of the partnering with other organizations can really be exploring how many of our Kenmore residents come to your Montlake Terrace pool?
Yep.
How many of our Kenmore residents go to the Juanita High School pool? And finding out that information, because those aren't really that far away. If you look at the radius maps, we could get pretty myopic if we only look at our little city and think, oh, we got to provide this when there's already stuff built.
Right. So certainly we can look into it. I think maybe asking residents might be the best place to start, because I'm not sure that other recreation providers actually ask people.
They probably
Keep that
don't do
data. But
Yeah.
I think, as we start going into what can we talk to residents about further in terms of a survey that's not statistically valid, but is just polling people, that might be a good question to ask.
Yeah.
I'll just finish up here, and then we can open it up, more discussion and questions. Recreation participation rates was another area that we did analysis on. And this is related to athletic sports, and again, you had mentioned, talking about fields, and the key findings here were essentially that, Morelands Park is right now our only multi-purpose field that we use for baseball and soccer that we have available in the city, and that the Bastyr fields are not ours, but they are open to the community to use for baseball and soccer. The estimate that we look at in terms of extrapolating data based on a 25% increase in population is that there'd be a need for 2 additional baseball fields and 3 soccer fields, which still seems pretty unrealistic to be able to provide within our city limits. One of the ways we can close that gap is, and to make sure we at least have what we have, is to work with Bastyr on extending the lease for the Bastyr fields past 2025, and investigating regional opportunities, again, like you had mentioned, on providing a multi-purpose athletic complex, which a lot of other cities do have access to, like Linwood, where you'll see more than one ball field or soccer field or multi-use field together that provides a better place for people to go for athletics versus just a neighborhood park or a school field. And then you may also know that we're in the process of looking at a lease with state parks for the field at St. Edward State Park. That's still in process. That's another potential opportunity. Aquatics. Again, the analysis that was provided talks a lot about prior use and where how high that use was from some pools that were nearby. North Shore Pool, which still exists in Bothell, that's open to the community, has a pretty high rate of use, but it's mostly intended for recreational swimming versus athletic swimming, lap swimming. And what St. Edward State Park pool used to operate at, they're pretty high numbers. Interesting conversation around how far people would go. I do know people go far. I know, with even where I live, I talk to parents all the time. They go to places like Montlake Terrace and Linwood, even Snohomish County, which have really great community pools with amenities that people are looking for now, which is more than just a box of water. So we do know that people do go pretty far, but when we used to have a lot more regionally, we had a lot more pools available to us. And in this area, when you look at other parts of the region, just in King County, with the old forward thrust pools, there's a lot still out there in use, but in our area, we're kind of like a little black hole of ones that haven't survived. And so I think maybe that's one of the reasons why people still have high interest in trying to get access to aquatics. But the recommendations and the key findings are that again, very highly used in the past, and there is still people who think it's a highly desirable thing to have in our community. But again, the feasibility study that Debbie talked about mentioned that any kind of proposal would have to be at a regional level and have partnerships with that developing that jurisdictional area that we would be providing that regional aquatic facility. So it's not a thing that Kenmore can do on its own, and it certainly may not be the largest driver in making it happen. Whereas some of the other larger cities that might have a need might be coming forward to helping meeting that need. That summarizes the different areas of analysis that we did. Our next steps is, don't know why that happened. Okay, that's not. So the next step that we'll be bringing back to you in July is really taking the analysis of that and developing recommendations for facilities and programs and developing a draft level of service analysis that will tie into those recommendations. So we're close, but we just didn't have everything pulled together for this meeting, and this gives you a good sense of where we're headed. And certainly there's more work ahead, so we're happy to take and entertain any questions and comments that you have this time.
So for the next round, what I'm interested in seeing, and I don't know if this is in the next round or way down in the future. So we have some work that's ongoing, developing different parks and areas in the community. And I'd like to see those and the financial impacts of those for both finishing the development, kind of like a timeline of this is when it's going to be done and this is how much money we're expecting it's going to take.
If I can clarify, are you talking about the projects which are in the Park Capital Improvement Program, the 6-year CIP?
Right, so
Okay.
so kind of looking at those across all of our other needs to see if what we've got in the pipeline is meeting some of the higher needs. It seemed like there was a huge need for trails and walking, that was a big thing. So if we're in the process of doing that, I'd like to see that, you know, in terms of figuring out where we want to spend the money. The other thing that I need to be educated on is how we get money to maintain the parks once we've got them. That seems to be an issue for a lot of cities, is they've developed something and then they don't have the funds to keep it up. So I'd like to understand that, kind of looking forward too. And then I remember the city manager giving a projection of the Kenmore budget over time, and it kind of passes like a red line out in the future. So I'd kind of like to understand all of those components in the view to help us prioritize where we want to spend money in general, what we've got going on and so forth.
Yeah, I really think it'd be nice to know where we are at with our walkway and waterways budget. I realize that's an ongoing work of the city, but it kind of would be nice to know, okay, we raised the $10 million bond. Have we burned through the whole $10 million, and what did we get for that? The public might want to know that. And then as we move forward with these aspirational goals, is the plan for the city to do these bond packages each time we want to develop a park? But then it goes back to, how do you maintain them? I mean, even my neighborhood park had a great revamp a number of years ago, but there's no ongoing maintenance, and there's a real disconnect with our neighborhood. We could pull together volunteers to do stuff, but anytime somebody gets the gumption to go to the city, there's not really a plan in place to interface with the public on getting that work done. So that's free volunteer help, but that's an asset that the city isn't really looking at, the citizens who want to make it look good. And I know you talked about that in the plan,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
you know, I
that's a
think
trend.
it's a trend, but it's also very smart
Yep.
financially. And it builds that, civic pride and bonding together as a group, whatever.
I can respond a little bit, if I may, on the walkways and waterways. So in July, that's when typically council takes a look at the 6-year capital improvement program. And at that time, then, they'll be looking at updated budget numbers for all the capital projects, including Log Boom and Squires as walkways and waterways. So that's when that budget discussion will happen.
Okay.
I can tell you that in the meantime, those projects are moving along nicely within the permit process, so we are still on track to have those 2 projects constructed by 2023, which is what the voters were told we do, so we're still on track to do that. So how far we get into that topic, I would say we may have to wait a little bit until we kind of figure out council direction and when that information is presented to them. I also believe that there will be an upcoming newsletter coming out that goes out to the public with an update on the walkways and waterways. So again, timing's everything.
Sure.
It will be coming probably in the next month.
Yeah, that's great to know. And I just like the fact that you want to keep the public informed, because if we do have, raising money as our strategy for park development over time, we have to prove we're good stewards of what we've done in the past. And just giving updates like that, people want to know.
Absolutely, it's that the taxpayers voted for it. They want to know that their dollars are being spent wisely and that we deliver on the projects that the city said it would deliver on. So yes, keeping the public up to speed is absolutely what we need to do. You raised questions about funding for maintenance, and I think, there is a park operating budget, which is based on, typically what a public works department needs to do to keep the parks ticking over in terms of general maintenance or any renovations. So there is an operating budget, but I sense that what you may be getting at more is what do we do when more replacement of facilities. So that's how do we fund those? Well, again, it would come up within the budget cycle, and if it's above a certain dollar amount, then it would be a capital project rather than an ongoing operating parks thing. As the city looks at its financial feasibility plan, which is on the council agenda for this year, I'm pretty sure that ongoing maintenance of facilities, whether it's road facilities or surface water facilities or parks facilities, is going to be a big topic of conversation. So again, more to come on that. And again, that's probably something where, it's information that we can provide you, but the direction is probably going to be more at the council level. And then volunteers, if anybody wants to volunteer, I would say have the volunteers come down to City Hall, and if there is a particular park or something that the neighbours are willing to take on, then, don't be shy about asking, I would say. We'll make it work.
Do you have a designated volunteer coordinator for that sort of thing? Do you have city policy in place of how you would go, interfacing with a group who's interested?
We do not have a specific volunteer coordinator position anymore, but the city is always willing to work with volunteers. And for those of you who went to the Love of Kenmore event, being a co-creator, in other words, having the public come and take the lead, we're all for that and willing to support however we can. So we don't really have a huge park stewardship program yet, but again, that's probably something in the pros plan that we'll be looking at if that makes sense to put together. And again, it's a timing and resource question, because volunteers, even though they're volunteering, it's not free. There still needs to be some city resources to be able to support that effort. So that is something, again, that will be discussed within the pros plan.
It's been interesting to watch what the city of Seattle has done, because it's one thing to talk about the manpower out there that's interested, but you still have to have a strategic plan of what you're going to let these people do, and do they have the skill set to even help with landscape maintenance or painting benches or whatever it is.
Right.
So it's complicated.
It is complicated. It is complicated, but I would say, at some point maybe that's where there needs to be some resources and time spent on the best use of volunteers and how to supplement those with what the city does, but we're not there yet.
Yeah.
But again, if there was sort of a specific, small project that the neighbours wanted to do, have them call Public Works or me or whoever, and we'll make it happen.
It's much better to turn people's thoughts towards what could we do rather than just ruminating on what needs to be done.
Sure, absolutely.
So I can give an example of the park cleanup. So through the Heritage Society, we're wanting to make some improvements over at the annex. And so we met Quinn Prophet out there.
Okay.
And we have a group of people who's interested, and he said, just come to us with a date. We'll provide a couple of city folks along with you, and, you know, you can have at it. There's still the concerns that you mentioned about, you know, whether you have the adequate tools and knowledge to start hacking away at things. But I think that the focus of the volunteers will be contained enough and focused that it's manageable.
And just to follow up on two things that Debbie said, excuse me, in terms of how do we get money to maintain the park system over time, mostly through repair and replacement of park assets, that goal that we've developed about, you know, is there a sustainable way to maintain the park system? That's intending to kind of talk a little bit more about the need for, you know, we did this inventory, we did a condition assessment of our assets. So we're going to need to be looking at like when is the right time to do life cycle replacement for particular assets. And the first thing that we just did, we got our assets into an asset management tool, which the city has access to. And now that we have our assets in to this basically GIS-oriented system, is that we can now track more information on maintenance and when things need to be replaced and repaired. And that is a step in the right direction to trying to figure out when do we replace this playground. It was put in on this date. And so all of that data will be into this system, which tracks it based on where it's located in, you know, GIS terms, and then all of this information that's tied with it. So that's just kind of where we're headed in terms of both our operations and then also what the plan's trying to get at.
Has there been a thought of doing something like a Discovery Pass, but for city parks?
No,
Where
not that I
you-
know.
No, so it's like a user fee
Yeah.
for parks. No, I don't know if that might come up during budget discussions at some point where there will be a user fee. Right now, the city doesn't have any fees for general access to the parks. The only fees are related to rental of the picnic shelter at Rhododendron Park or rental of the ball field at Morelands. Those are the two I can think of right now. And I think for the hangar building, I think there's a deposit for use of the facilities, but no other user fees. And the same for this facility here as well.
And the other thing I was going to mention about that I'm hoping that the plan will also address in terms of like how do we work through stewarding our properties is the idea of building partnerships with service organizations such as Earth Corps, Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust, other environmental stewards who can work with us on getting grants and lining up what to do. They have the knowledge about the natural resources and how to manage and maintain them. We don't have the staff to do that, and we don't often have the ability to garner all the volunteers, but some of those organizations already have that in place. So the idea would be, you know, as we develop these goals of being able to try to develop a volunteer program, maybe someplace like Squires Landing where we're going to be doing a large body of vegetation improvements and natural resource improvements to make sure that we maintain that over time. The idea would be that we're going to try to build partnerships with those organizations so that we can make that happen. And they are often really good at getting volunteers to come out and lead volunteers, which is what we don't have. So by utilizing other people's experiences really helps us as a small city.
Going off of what Commissioner Greathouse said, that had crossed my mind a while back too, was some sort of fee for the parks. But I know that my fear was it might discourage the people who drive to the parks from using them, and I don't think we want parks that are there that people now don't use because they don't want to pay this fee. Is there any way we could look into other cities who have implemented this program and the park kind of use before and after it was implemented to see if there was a dramatic decrease or if it would be feasible to implement here within the city?
Sure. I mean, we could look into it. The only local park groups that I know that do anything with recharge in terms of charging people to access parks is really just in terms of parking. I think it's King County at not Magnuson Park, but
Yeah.
Marymore,
Yeah,
where they charge you to park.
and that's what
that's
I
an
was referring
example,
to, is
yeah.
like parking fees.
Kind of parking fees is the only example that I know locally where that exists.
In a way, it's contrary to the whole idea of a regional park or a city park. It's made available through the collective of citizens so that it doesn't have a fee.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and
But-
our goals to try to make the park system equitable is also something we have to keep in mind. you know.
Yeah,
yeah,
Charging fees discourages people who have no means. And the place that parks really are valuable is this cross-pollination of people from
yeah.
different backgrounds and economic benefits. And so,
But then you look at some of the interesting parks like the Arboretum or the Kabuto Gardens. Obviously, they've been there for 100 years, but they've been included in the park system, and they do have different mechanisms to raise money for the park through foundations and
correct.
docent programs, all kinds of things. But, you know, if it's a water access park like Squires Landing, maybe we'll have to get creative about how people learn about it and participate. So,
Yeah, special interest or special use facilities are unique in that way that
yeah.
they do have different ways in which you care for those facilities. And foundations are interesting, but they're also very difficult to manage. Trying to even create a foundation, but that's essentially like the Parks Foundation in Seattle. Again, it's on a large scale, so we're a very small city.
Yeah,
Likely, they probably won't be able to do that for the whole system, but that's how they do fundraising for either capital projects or for park projects that need improvement in parks.
and Vashon Island has done a really interesting land trust, public-private land trust, which is probably more complicated than what our park system is, but it's still worth looking at and thinking about why did that take place and why do people feel committed to protecting this land. And, water access for us is kind of our big asset. So as we continue to acquire properties, it's just something to look at.
Don't we have one of those that is under consideration right now, kind of over by Bastyr, where a family has given some property? It seems like there was something about that at one of the city council meetings. I may be remembering it incorrectly,
I
but
think it was we'll check the facts, but my recollection, it was they were trying to get a break on their taxes
Right.
because most of the land is vacant, it was unusable, it's a piece of, fairly close to St. Edward State Park. And so to get that reduction, they had to get the city's approval as well as King County's approval. So I think it was tax related. But to get that tax break, they had to provide or allow for public access to their property.
right.
So that's what I remember it being.
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that's right. So that, I
Okay.
suppose that's potentially another way to get some park land.
I don't think that they're not giving the parkland, it's just allowing
The access.
access.
But I know in looking at access along the waterfront between park areas.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, entertaining ideas with private owners with regards to basically conservation easements that would allow public access. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
and actually going off of that, it was brought to my attention that there's a couple of properties adjacent to, on the east side of Squires Landing Park, who were looking, and I guess had approached the city with kind of an intent to sell to the city because they're not using that property or something like that. On the east side, the properties adjoining
Okay.
Squires Landing Park.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that would be kind of a good thing to look into, or maybe work with them, especially on the lower part of the park, or finding some way to get a piece of area that could be used for other purposes, especially some of the goals that we were looking at earlier.
Well, I've definitely been involved with looking at property opportunities, and especially around Squires Landing. So be curious to know more about that, because we have engaged with property owners in that area already who are not willing to sell. But if you know of ones that are, it's always good to know. So pass it along if you know more details.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a handful of questions from the draft demand and need analysis that was in the memo. So now a good time to go over those from the packet?
Sure.
Okay. First, maybe following up on walkways and waterways, when it's completed, how, I know we talked about connectivity and trails obviously being really important. How much of that need will be met, specifically for connectivity, between the parks? Is that a major piece, the walkways and waterways, specifically the sidewalks and bike lanes, going from north to south? How much of the issue will that solve, I guess is what I'm asking.
We definitely, in our mapping, are showing the walkways projects as providing for that network.
Yeah.
Again, in terms of answering your question on the waterways projects, again, yes, a lot of what we're seeing here is that our current project will meet some need, but it's not going to address, they're kind of major vines, like the Juanita Drive and 68th Vine, and like I mentioned, the Burke-Gilman Vine. We've got really great connectivity, but what you're trying to do is over time develop better, safe routes that people can walk easily, not just on those uninterrupted stretches, but from there to parks and through parks. And so that's the part of this concept that's still something that we would want to aspire to. So yes, these projects are meeting need, but they're not meeting the entire need of a 20-year or longer vision. And that's something you just want to keep in mind. They are going to meet some of the immediate need that the community is experiencing.
Going off of immediate need, I know you said that you had done some other analysis back in, what did you say, 2013, and had a list then, and then have re-updated it. The things that have remained constant, have those taken a higher priority now that we've seen that they've remained constant within what the city wants?
Well, I think that the walkways and waterways bond measure was sort of a direct outcome of people wanting improved pedestrian and sidewalk facilities and improved access to the water. So I think since 2013, and then the outreach in 2015, which was called Imagine Kenmore, that directly led to the bond measure responding to those concerns. So I think that's why there are those major projects, and the community said they not only wanted them, but they were willing to pay for them as well.
Okay. Were there any others that also have remained since 2013 that maybe weren't covered by those?
The capital facilities plan? Yes, I mean, in April, we discussed what projects were not complete from the capital facilities plan. There is a list, and we have it, it's still there. The thing to remember about the capital facilities plan is it's an unconstrained list, which means it's not, budgeted, and it's aspirational. And the reason why we do that is to make sure that we can have in our plan projects that we hope to be able to accomplish in case finances or grants come, align where we can make projects happen. Where we have to be more specific about where is the money coming from is the 6-year CIP that Debbie was mentioning that we review every year, and that this plan will address what the current 6-year needs are. And then we hope to be able to provide some short-term, long-term, and mid-term needs. The short-term would equate to about the 6 years. So that's your immediate need. And then your mid-term needs are ones you think we should try to accomplish first over the longer-term needs. An example probably is, unless we get a lot of regional support and coordination, an aquatic facility would not probably be a short-term need. It would be a long-term need, because it would require a lot of planning and a lot of coordination to make it happen. But an example could be that in the interim between the 6 years and, let's say, 12 years, that in midterm, maybe Linwood Park is an example of a midterm need that's still on our capital facilities list since it's been on the list since 2013. We know it has a need for being improved, the only park in the system that hasn't received some major improvements outside of probably Wallace Swamp Creek Park. And being able to identify that potentially as a midterm need. So does that kind of help you? That's where we're going with the conversation from July 16th moving forward, is trying to identify what those priorities might be based on what the need analysis shows us, what level of service shows us, and then what recommendations would we make for the plan.
And that's something that when the 6-year capital improvement program is developed, you take a look at what the list of projects are, and then you go back and see are those a higher or a lower priority, and how would they be funded. So since 2013, the city has acquired property to meet some of those needs, those natural areas acquisitions, trail projects like the Tolt Trail. For example, there have been some park development, North Shore Summit Park, the Moorlands Park. So there has been several projects that have happened since 2013, when the last PROS plan was developed, to sort of try and directly implement the projects to meet that need and focus on those priorities, whether it's access to the water or nature trails or active recreation. The skate park was 2015. So we try and create that balance in the CIP for funded projects.
Thank you.
Yeah, and a lot of that, you can go back and look at the presentation that we made in April 16th. That's where we discussed a lot of that information, what was completed, what we accomplish from the 2013 list, and what do we still have left. So again, if you need a little reminder, go back and take a look at that for yourself.
Will this presentation also be up for us to review if we want to?
I'm pretty sure they're available through the city's website, aren't they?
They should be. We can send you a link to File Pro.
Thank you.
It would be nice to have a link to both of them. I know I remember looking at the one from April 16th, but if you could send a link to both.
Yeah, the memo, your
Thanks.
memo has the links in them.
Oh, okay.
So you just, and you get this electronically, correct?
Yes, I do.
So you can
Just
you can
click on it.
access the links there.
Okay.
Oh, another question I had. Are there any parks that we currently have that could support some of the things that we've been looking at? Take, for example, maybe finding a way to fit in a ball field or two at Twin Springs Future Park, the Future Park. Is that possible, or are there any facilities that we have that could handle something like that?
Twin Springs is not suitable for ball fields. It's a large park in terms of area. It's about 26 acres. There's only probably about 4 acres outside of wetlands and steep slopes, and those 4 acres are in a very narrow band.
Okay.
So it really, it's not the best fit in terms of parks for ball fields, unfortunately.
That was just an example, but are there any other parks that we have that might be able to accommodate that?
Off the top of my head, I can't really think of an area that would be suitable. So to support a ball field, you're probably looking at 3 to 4 acres to support a ball field, to get parking and everything else that you need. So if you look at other 3 to 4 acres in the city's current parks, that's where you start to sort of scratch your head and say, I don't know where we do that. So that's why we've been trying to work with state parks to improve the St. Edward's ball field, to partner with another agency who has an existing ball field that we could renovate. That's why we've worked with Bastille. The school districts, their fields are largely programmed, so while you could make improvements to them, it would not increase capacity. So really, you would either be looking at partnering perhaps with other cities on more of a regional or a facility that was shared, or the city would have to look at acquiring new property within the city. And again, that again becomes a challenge when you're looking for a 3 to 4 acre piece of property that's suitable and not constrained by critical areas. So we know that that's a challenge, and how we meet that future need.
I was just curious.
Yep.
Thank you.
And were you intending to discuss, like, do we have ideas for where to put other amenities outside of fields, where it just fields that you were referring to?
Well, not just fields,
Yeah,
but
that's what I
anything
thought.
else. Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other thing that we had on our
Yeah.
list of goals that we wanted to accomplish.
That's some of the work that would have to go into, as you begin a project, like, we need to provide an off-leash area. So as you begin a project like that, you have to look at your system and analyze different sites to determine whether they would be able to accommodate those things based on criteria, like, is there sufficient parking? Is it close to neighbors? So as we would start to ramp up on meeting one of those park project needs, like, we're going to do a ball field, like, just say that, we'd have to, as the beginning part of that project, you'd have to go through that process to determine the best locations for it. So there is ability to meet certain needs for certain assets, like trends in recreation that we might be able to meet, and we've mentioned some of those in the analysis around City Hall Park, for example. There's other areas, but again, until it becomes an active project, you often don't have the knowledge yet to get there, to know exactly where it's going to go.
But I think that's sort of philosophically, that's where you would tend to start with looking at the property that you have control over for these facilities first. There are master plans adopted for several of the parks. So again, you would look at what is included in the master plan. Do we need to update the master plan? And if we are, is there room then to address some of these needs within the current park? So I think that's where we would normally start the discussion of how we meet these needs and based on the assets that we currently have. Got some great questions tonight.
So I know that it was brought up about improving sidewalks and walkways, and so that falls under the PROS plan, is that correct? Or is that tied in from another project with the PROS plan?
Trails are generally in the PROS plan, sidewalks really not so much, although they're usually in the transportation capital project list, but they do have a direct link to the park system, but they're not specifically addressed in the PROS plan.
Okay, because I know that we had the one map that overlaid potential sidewalk renovations or improvements along with the parks, and I wasn't sure
Right.
how.
Right, so it's
Okay.
kind of matching the two together, although it's not necessarily in the park capital budget or in the PROS plan. It's good to look at that because they provide those linkages.
I was just curious about that because I had another kind of follow-up question about that. If there's any way to link that up and work with it a little bit more, and maybe making the areas that aren't within that 10-minute walk radius or that are that white space, maybe improving the walkways along there so that they do become more walkable, and can kind of maybe increase that range to the parks.
Great idea, thank
Yep.
you.
Yep.
Because I know just for myself, I am within that white range. So getting to and from the parks, it can be a little difficult sometimes. But I think if we can increase that or improve those walkways, it may shorten down time and increase the accessibility to our parks.
Great.
Great questions. Yeah, I agree. So adult fitness and wellness programs are obviously in other programs are greatly desired. To supply those, it doesn't necessarily take a full-blown rec center, right? There are other facilities, either existing or that could be potentially developed for that. I guess I'm just wondering what the sort of from a facility standpoint, how you're looking at, what are some of the options that, again, already exist maybe here in the community? I know there's senior centers and there's a community center and other ways. And I'm also wondering if, with all the downtown development, if there's any way to, partner with, maybe not the ones that have already been built, but the ones that might be coming down the road to see if there might be a partnership with, the developers in terms of providing some kind of fitness, publicly accessible. I'm sure they each have their own. I see the folks out there in their bikes there on the indoor facility across the street. But, so yeah, I'm wondering if that's a partnership opportunity as well, so.
Great, yeah, we
Okay.
should we should definitely add that,
Yeah.
private-public partnership
Yeah,
opportunities. And in terms of facilities, I mean, outside of what we know already, no, we don't have any, plan for or knowledge about, how to provide that, other than what we are, trying to describe in here is that what we need to do a better job of is identifying key players that could provide that facility need, whether it's indoor or outdoor recreation opportunities, and kind of key up with them and see if they can provide either the facility or provide the recreation programming for meeting our community need for recreation.
Right. Are churches an option? I know there's been discussions in the past, churches providing other, types of facilities, housing for, I guess, temporary homeless shelters and such, so.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity.
Another question I had was kind of bouncing around a little bit on the youth sports. I think you had, was it the year 2016? Was that the year that you had the figures for this? I think it's
Yeah.
baseball and soccer.
Yeah.
Do you have any trend figures on those? I used to be involved in both those quite a few years ago, and I honestly can't remember the numbers of kids we had in both those programs. I mean, is it flat? Is it going up? Is it declining? Do you have any sense about the participation in those, specifically the ball field type sports, for assessing the need, looking into the future and projecting potentially?
Right. I know when the city applied for grants for the ball field, that there was data collected specifically from the youth leagues for baseball and soccer on their participation rates and anticipated growth. So we can provide that. I just don't remember those numbers.
That's what this is.
Oh, that's what this number is.
So the 2016 numbers are from that process. So that's our most recent outreach we did to them. But what I think we were trying to extrapolate is just based on our knowledge of growth, what that projection would be. That's where we came up with our key finding. In terms of just reaching out to them, I think that's the best approach would be, we do a follow-up with them just to say, is your 2016 numbers trending up or down?
Exactly,
And
right,
that's what you're
right.
just asking us to do,
Yeah,
right?
basically,
Okay.
yeah. See if we can get some data on that to understand that better. And the St. Anne's ball fields, if it does get, again, is that in the process? I know it's at the state level, Debbie. Is it I know it's a long story, but can you summarize
I
where
can give you a
where that is?
3-bullet short version. It's still under permit review. We are still trying to work with the state on obtaining a long-term lease, and where we currently are is beginning a SEPA EIS process. A couple of weeks ago, there was council authorization on an interagency agreement that the city would reimburse the state for consultant costs for phase 1 of the SEPA EIS process. That's where we are. So we're still, I guess, in permit and environmental review. Assuming that the permits are issued, and there's a lot of assumptions I'm going to make here, assuming the permits are issued, assuming the city gets a long-term lease with state parks, when would the soonest be for construction? Probably 2024.
And again, is it city funded for construction if it gets to that point? Or is it a combined?
It would be city funds and a variety of grant sources as match.
Right, okay. I think that's all the questions I personally had on that document. Anything else on our presentation or on the draft we've seen tonight from anybody? Any other things that you're looking for from us tonight?
No. If you after you think about the report some more, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to provide those. There's just because you don't think of it at the meeting doesn't mean you can't provide them outside of the meeting, but please provide those comments directly to staff if you have them.
Great, okay, well, anything else for us?
No, I think you cancelled your July 2nd meeting, just as a reminder, and we'll show up again on July 16th to continue the parks discussion, and at that time we'll probably be giving you an update on the mobile home park project as well.
Great.
Will
Okay.
will we just get an update, or will we have a packet to start working on that? Don't really know yet.
To be honest, I should have checked in with Laurie before I came tonight, and I didn't. So I guess more to come on that.
Okay,
If there'll be anything in the packet, or if there is, it will be in the packet.
okay,
I'm assuming. So yeah,
okay. But in the meantime, we're just going to focus on the pros plan.
we're definitely focusing on the pros plan, on moving that forward, and again on the mobile home park project. We need to think about the direction on that. As I mentioned at the last meeting, we did receive an appeal to the growth board on the ordinance the council adopted, putting that mobile home park zoning in place over all parks.
Okay.
Okay, this meeting is adjourned.